Hi, I'm Ryan Hackett, and I'm going to be talking about the primary readings of David Newhouse's Imagining New Worlds. An idea that drives contemporary modern Aboriginal societies is that our ideas of self, such as how we conceive ourselves, in a fundamental driving force for several human actions. The readings discuss a few events in David's time. During the discussion that he had with one of his classes, the nature of traditional knowledge, a student said that they were taught not to question but to accept. This was a very profound statement to Newhouse. This statement made it appear as though the Aboriginal knowledge is passed on over and over unchanged. Shocked by this, his students had actually believed this for many, many years. David also talks about imagination itself. He demonstrates imagination as something inside of human beings that make them human. The power of imagination is a driving force for human beings. When the world becomes such a difficult place, we use imagination as a place to escape. Children use imagination to create things. People who come from tough backgrounds use it to escape. Authors use imagination to understand their character inside their novel. A few years back, David attended an exhibit called The Spirit Sings, where he saw Aboriginal imagination as well as transforming them into something real. He talks a lot about the Aboriginal people being hurt, but using their imaginations to heal themselves and to move forward in the new world and removing pain from past time. The Aboriginal people imagine a world in which we respect Aboriginal culture, a world in which we are proud of our cultures, languages, and spirituality. Aboriginal community takes a look at the world and the future in such a positive way. They are working and making that a reality. The second primary reading I'll be doing is How Did We Get Here? The relationship between Indigenous people and Canada. For over a century, Canadian policies were put into place to decrease First Nations people's way of life and make it a dominant settler society. The Crown, which is the government, acted in its own interest to gain access to Indigenous lands, so therefore the settlers benefited. With a flawed view on European settlers' superiority, the First Nations people were in result starved, relocated to new communities, as well as the government attempting to take away their laws, cultures, language, and governments, things that made people human. Many Indigenous peoples were killed. Canada is to develop their post-colonial consciousness to try and fix their mistakes, but there still is pain in First Nations hearts as they try to rebuild what they have lost. The Crown saw Indigenous land as empty and free for the taking. The Crown considered First Nations people to be using the land in an uncivilized manner, when in reality they used the land for hunting, fishing, farming so that they could feed their families. First Nations took care of their land, but the Europeans did not see it as this. The Europeans took farmers' livestock so they couldn't feed their families or make money. This put them into areas where families were homeless and into a state of poverty. Next, I'm going to be talking about the fur trade. The fur trade is where the Europeans gave fur to the Indigenous people as a sign of friendship and a peace offering. The only thing the Indigenous people did not know was the fur contained deathly diseases such as smallpox. This did kill many of the Indigenous community and brought their number and their population way down. Finally, I'm going to be talking about residential schools. The Crown also attempted to assimilate the First Nations through residential schools. These schools went from the late 1800s to the late 1990s. The attendance of these schools was legislated through the Indian Act, which gave the government the power to force the Indigenous children into these schools. And they did so by forcibly removing these children from their homes, whether it was their choice or not. The goal of these schools was to take the Indian out of the child. Children were punished if they were caught speaking their language or practicing cultures. Children were abused physically, emotionally, and sexually. Residential schools had such an effect on First Nations families and communities that they felt ashamed of their identity and chose not to pass it on.
Before the settlers arrived in North America or Turtle Island, there was roughly 500,000 Indigenous people and Aboriginal peoples living here on this island. So in 1763, the Royal Proclamation was signed and came out, and it stated that Aboriginal peoples had control of their lives and that they had all this land throughout Canada and it could only be given to the government like through treaties and sale. So between the time of 1610 and 1680, the French and the British were showing up and like, yeah, new land. But the issue was they weren't quite ready for Canadian winters. So they formed relationships that were symbiotic. So that way both groups worked together and survived. Because otherwise, the settlers would not be able to survive these really frigid Canadian winters. And then between 1680 and 1800s, the Aboriginal peoples became far more dependent on our European settlers and the fur trade. With the fur trade, there was lots of different cultures switching back and forth between the groups. For example, blankets would be shared from the Europeans to the Aboriginal people. Unbeknownst to our Aboriginal friends, these blankets were likely infected with smallpox amongst other diseases. They had no treatments. These diseases were unfamiliar to them. So it was like an epidemic. And for example, the Beothuk people from Newfoundland are now extinct. The next timeline we're looking at is between 1800 and 1830. So there was some shifts happening here. For example, the War of 1812 between the British and the French, where the French lost to the British. But the major thing here is that the relationship between the Europeans and the Aboriginals was no longer symbiotic. Whereas the Europeans no longer saw the Aboriginals as necessary to their survival, they started to be seen as more of like something to avoid or a problem. And to the Aboriginals, a relationship was something that needed constant tending to. It was a living creature. So now between 1830 and 1920, there's multiple things that happened, but the biggest one, in my opinion, would be the Indian Act. So with the Indian Act, there was lots of different things that came through that, where, for example, you couldn't sell munitions to Aboriginal people. You were forced to live on your reserve, enfranchisement, the list goes on and on. Residential schools. It's just a continuation of belittling and trying to destroy the Aboriginal culture and force them to assimilate into European culture. So, and now we're going to think somewhere between 1930 and 1970, we had the White Paper, which came out in 1969, right near the end of this little time period we're looking at. And overall, it was trying to eliminate the legal concept of a status Indian and just kind of make everybody a simple Canadian. So there were no Aboriginal rights or Aboriginal peoples. This was countered with the Red Paper, which came out in 1970, and then the White Paper became repealed in 1971. Now, in 1970, the Supreme Court acknowledged First Nations have Aboriginal rights. So they were acknowledging a lot of what was agreed in all the treaties that were signed over the last couple hundred years. Then between 1972 and 2015, lots of different things happened. There was a Reconciliation Act. The 1982 Constitution Act actually gave all the Aboriginal rights to the Aboriginal peoples. There was the 95 calls to action. Stephen Harper had his apologize. Like, he apologized for what happened through the residential school systems. But one thing I'd like to talk about was enfranchisement. So it started off as voluntary, and then it became enforced. And when you were enfranchised, you were you're giving up your rights and status as an Indian, and you now became a European citizen. Congratulations, you can now vote and own land. Catch is, the land came from your reserve. If you lose the land or you die, it doesn't go back to your people, it stays with the government. As well, if you were an Aboriginal woman and you married a non-Aboriginal man, sorry, you've lost your status. And now your children will have no status even if they came with you. And yet, an Aboriginal man who marries a non-Aboriginal woman, she gets the status. With the Constitution Act, this amended all of this. It kind of flipped it all upside down. So, in 1985, Bill C-31 passed. And this, according to my notes, it's bringing the act into accordance with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So now you can't lose your status from marriage. You could regain your lost status if you're enfranchised or married out of it. Enfranchisement is now abolished.